It's Thursday, the 15th of December. This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Bim Afolami, Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran, Tortoise Media's political editor Kat Neelan and political journalist and commentator Isabel Oakeshott. Today, nurses are staging the largest strike in NHS history over pay.
What I'm asking for is the 20% that has been eroded from our nurses' pay over the last decade.
If we do inflation matching pay rises, that can actually drive inflation further.
Following the tragedy in the Channel, Britain and France vow to break the business model of people smugglers. But how? Matt Hancock's critics say he is rewriting pandemic history with his new book. Isabel Oakeshott helped him write it. We'll ask her why.
Can I take a picture? Can I take a picture?
And remember him? He's apparently already earned £1 million since leaving Number 10. Should MPs be able to make money on the side? And just as we come on air, we've had the latest interest rate decision by the Bank of England. They've raised rates by 0.5%, so they've gone to their highest level in 14 years at 3.5%. We'll pick up on that interest rate rise designed to combat inflation, but will also put pressure on the cost of living a little later in the programme. Let's go back to that story that we mentioned in the headlines about Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister. This is the story in BBC News. Boris Johnson makes more than £1 million from speeches since leaving office. He's made three, particularly, speeches abroad, New York-based investment banking firm, Centreview Partners, the Hindustan Times and a Portuguese TV station. Is it OK for MPs to earn this kind of money on the side, Bim?
Well, I think that you shouldn't prohibit members of Parliament, like anybody else. If people want to pay them a lot of money for speeches, then they should be able to do that and he should be able to accept them. The opposite view, if you were to somehow ban people from, say, making speeches or writing books or advising people on as an accountant or whatever it is that they were to do, if you were to stop that and prohibit it somehow, what you would end up doing is just benefiting people who had inherited wealth, say from maybe rents from homes or land that they owned. And so you would be stopping people from quite legitimately and very openly and transparently earning money that people choose to pay them in the private sector and only benefiting those with inherited wealth. For me, that strikes me as a very odd way of doing things.
Layla?
I mean, the £1 million will stick in the throat of a lot of people going through a cost of living crisis right now. But I think the main thing is an MP putting their constituents first and spending the vast majority of their time doing that. I think what worried me about Boris Johnson in his recent remarks isn't so much the amount of money he's making from speeches. We know that former PMs do this. He's not the only one.
Although he's still an MP.
He's still an MP. But then he said something, I think it was an op-ed might have been The Spectator, where he basically said he's at a career hiatus, he wants to write all these books. The question I have for him is, well, why is he sticking around as an MP? If he's got all of these opportunities, he can make all this money and he'd much rather be writing lots of books. It is such an honour and a privilege to do this job. I genuinely think that if your mind is wandering and you've got all the time in the world to do other things, then you've really got to question whether it's the job for you.
Kat, Theresa May, another former Prime Minister, also still in the House of Commons, was paid approximately £107,600. That sounds quite precise for a speaking event from the World Travel and Tourism Council in November. Should MPs get paid for these sorts of gigs?
Yes, so I mean, as we were just saying then, Theresa May actually is out-earning Boris Johnson still at the moment. I think the question is not so much whether MPs should be able to earn this money, but what kind of checks and balances are on where the money originally comes from. So speeches are one thing, but there are sort of consultancies and all sorts of second jobs where there is a much more sort of opaque sort of source of income. And I think that is really where we should be focusing our attentions.
Isabel?
I don't really have a problem with Boris Johnson earning any figure at all for his speeches. I think that probably some of his clients were rather ripped off, given that Boris has a tendency to recycle the same speech. They could easily have, after speech number 1, got hold of it and invested in a hologram, and it would have been an awful lot cheaper. I think Layla's point, though, is probably the most important one, which is that MP still giving a proper level of service to their constituents? I mean, the reason that Boris is hanging around is because he still dreams of a comeback. But ultimately, at this point in the electoral cycle, I know there's still 2 years to go, but the Tories are very, very much on a back foot. It's a high-risk thing to disappear and, globetrot and make huge amounts of money if you wish to be re-elected.
I mean, just on that, Bim, would you be looking forward to a comeback from Boris Johnson if that's the calculation that he's actually... Pardon?
No.
If that's the calculation he's making. But about...
I've got to remember I'm on TV, I've got to be very careful.
Oh, no, forget you're on TV. Okay. It's all very private. And in terms of constituents, do you think people can serve their constituents in a full manner if they are globetrotting and making this sort of money around the world?
So, frankly, in terms of time spent to make a speech, to prepare it and make a speech, it's actually pretty efficient compared to most other things people will do. I don't really think that's the point. I take Layla's point and all the other points very seriously, and they're all fair ones. My view, if we take away from sort of former prime ministers earning huge amounts of money, just for MPs doing more normal things, I think that the point is that we have always had in our system, MPs who have external interests at the same time as being members of Parliament. Part of those external interests, of course, is being a minister. In other countries, they make ministers, they cannot be members of the legislature. Our system is precisely opposite. And when people are ministers, especially senior ministers, the amount of time they spend on constituency matters is quite limited. It strikes me as odd if we were somehow to stop somebody doing speeches, which is pretty small amount of time in comparison with, for example, serving as a Prime Minister or Chancellor or Foreign Secretary or whatever.
All right, well, we've spent quite a lot of time on this. Let's get to the important issue of the strikes. On the front page of the Daily Mail, this is referencing the fact that nurses are on strike in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's the first of 2 day-long strikes over pay. Cancer care at risk as nurses strike. The Royal College of Nursing asking for a 19% pay rise, 5% above RPI inflation. The Daily Express, though, has this. Public sympathy for nurses remains high as some Tories call for government action. Give nurses a deal and stop this madness. There are reports that there could be further action if it's not resolved in January by nurses. Do you agree, Bim, with the Daily Express? Do a deal now.
Well, I hope there is a deal done.
But is it time to do it now?
Well, we should have... Ideally, you shouldn't have got to this position.
Right.
Obviously, the best situation is that we didn't have a strike. Well, no, it's where you have these disputes, and they happen from time to time, particularly at times we have high inflation. In the 1970s, when you had high inflation, was also when you had these sorts of disputes. The point is this, to have a rise of 19%, which, to be very clear, is what the nurses have asked for. And in fact, we saw it on the clip earlier, 19%, so basically 20%. That would be so significant in comparison across the whole public sector that what you would end up with is a wage price spiral across all the public sector and then also in the private sector as well. That would be significantly contributing to inflation.
All right, but one of your fellow Conservative MPs, Jake Berry, agrees with you on the 19%, but says improve the pay offer. Should the government improve the pay offer to nurses specifically now?
Well, obviously, there needs to be some form of accommodation reached, because we can't have the situation where nurses are on strike. But at the same time, we do have an independent pay body. And an independent pay body, though they operate to a remit, still is there to look at all the complicated factors to do with wages. They look at the labour market, they look at comparison.
But they did it several months ago. You can make a recommendation that goes above what the pay review body has actually set. That's what Jake Berry is saying, the former party chairman. Improve on the pay review board's advice. It sounds like you're saying you would like to see a pay offer, an improved one, being made.
What I'd like to see is nurses back in hospital.
Right.
So, however we get there, I'm sort of not that concerned by. What I think we need to do, I think it's critical that we do this because, and it's really important, this isn't just the fact that people today are going to suffer and not have cancer identified. It's the backlogs that then result from a day of not work that then it actually leads to much more time.
OK.
With people not getting treated properly.
Is the nurses' demand of 19% pay rise reasonable?
Well, the demand they made also was that they wanted ministers to sit round a table with them and talk. I mean, in any negotiation, you have what you want, and then you talk to someone, and then you come and meet in the middle. And we know from elsewhere in the country where that has happened, they averted the strikes.
Yeah.
And I've got constituents who have contacted me, a chap in his 80s who got a cancer diagnosis, 2-week wait, first treatment was meant to be on the 20th, and he contacted me because he's scared because that's been now postponed and they don't know, it's potentially 6 weeks down the line, and he's scared. And I don't understand why, when actually the primary demand was sit down with us, talk with us, 2 ministers, and they intransigently said, no, it's up to the public sector, it's up to the pay body, and, that's the law. I'm sorry, there comes a point where, yes, you have your processes for peacetime, but we are in a crisis, and it's not just the NHS, it's public sector workers across the country. But I have to say, especially the nurses who we went out and banged our pots and everything else for, I actually think if we do give them a bit more, that's just right.
All right, so you're talking about a bit more, maybe about 7 or 8%. You're right about strikes being avoided in Scotland, but actually in the last hour or so, the GMB union has rejected the improved NHS pay deal that was put on the table by the Scottish government. What do you say to that? Should the nurses or should the GMB union accept it?
I honestly don't know, and I don't know what the situation was in those talks, but what I do know is that saying that you're not going to talk at all is a hiding to nothing.
Kat?
Well, I noticed that Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, did say that his door was open. So we need to actually see whether that's real, whether there is an opportunity for people to get around the table and talk, as you say. But I do think this comes down to sort of political decisions that have been made. The triple lock was maintained for pensioners, some of whom are very wealthy, some of whom can go on holiday multiple times, haven't got mortgages to pay. Not saying that's the case with every pensioner, of course, but that is a political decision made because the Conservatives know these are the people they need.
And that was at about 10%, I think they made it, which is what inflation was at the time.
And as you've alluded to, the pay review body's decision was made in February when inflation was much lower, and we didn't quite know how the situation was going to land now. Now, it looks as though perhaps inflation might not be as bad as we thought, and I agree that perhaps this 17-19% demand is a bit excessive, but a compromise can and should be reached. As we all say, no one wants the nurses to be on strike.
I mean, I think that the strikes are immoral and unethical, and undoubtedly patients will suffer a great deal. And actually the irony here is that nurses who are overworked will be even more overworked as a result of the backlog, which is going to increase. But I'm quite sympathetic with their pay demand. I think quite clearly we need more nurses and we need to keep the ones that we've got. And I do think that the government shoulders quite a lot of responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in, when during the pandemic, where they were blithely dishing out billions on PPE, a lot of which turned out to be as good as useless, and offered nurses a 1% pay rise. And I think that if we had given more at that time, we wouldn't be in a situation now where the demand is at 19.
Ben?
If we had given... The difficulty is we didn't know what was going to happen with global inflation, right? This has really accelerated over the last 6-7 months. So it is easy to look back and say, well, actually, if we'd given nurses, I don't know, 2 years ago, 3% or 4%, and then given them another 3-4%, we wouldn't be in this situation. But of course, we didn't know. What we actually hoped was that by now, out of the pandemic, public finances would be in a better place, the economy would be coming back, and then, of course,
but
that hasn't...
Aren't.
Well, it's because of, obviously, the war in the Ukraine, energy crisis, and various other things. So the
there are
difficulty
external factors, yes.
at the time, of course, it may have been easier had we given nurses a high pay
now?
rise. But well, as I said, we do need to give nurses a pay rise, and it's all about the nature of the negotiation as to where we end up landing.
Right, a bigger pay rise, it sounds like. Why are the strikes immoral? If you're sympathetic to the pay demands of nurses, why are the strikes immoral?
Look, I just fundamentally don't believe in strikes. I don't personally think that if you are in a role which is critical, either critical national infrastructure or life-saving, that you should be able to withdraw your labour with no consequence. I realise that's quite an extreme position. I think you're entirely entitled to withdraw your labour, but don't expect a job at the end of it.
I think that the problem with that, of course, is that we need them. And there are nurses working today But the nurses that I've spoken to say that they are doing this absolutely as a last resort. You know, they all the points you made, Isabel, actually they agree with. You know, and fundamentally, actually, this isn't just about money. They've made this point before. This is also about safety. It's about the fact that there are 50,000 vacancies in the NHS. They don't feel respected. And this is why I think the point that
they're exhausted.
They're exhausted.
But striking isn't going to fill those vacancies.
The point
but
they're
if you
trying to
increase
make...
salaries, then you will get more people
There's about
filling
retention,
the roles.
there's retention, and then there's recruitment into the NHS. And this is a huge issue. This is an issue that the government hasn't dealt with. The workforce plan that Jeremy Hunt was calling for still hasn't materialised. You know, this is a huge problem, and they've been raising the alarm for years now. I think we all have sympathy with what they're trying to do. And the point is they wouldn't be doing it if they felt that they had not exhausted all other options. I think the government needs to listen. I do think, and for the sake of my constituent who wants his appointment on the 20th of December, I'm begging them, and I'm begging BIM and everyone in your party to go to Steve Barclay and say, just get round the table as a start. Because if you don't talk, you're not going to get anywhere.
We can't have a repeat of this.
We can't.
Absolutely can't. Look, the NHS is on its knees.
Well, that's what might happen in
this.
January. Is this the time, then, Bim, to have tougher laws about strikes? Rishi Sunak says he's prepared to introduce tough new strike laws to minimise disruption. Would you back that?
So I differ from Isabel insofar as I don't think that we should just blanket have a ban on strikes.
I mean,
but
other
I do think that in areas,
by the way, it's not
I agree,
wacky.
but where I would, what I would like personally to see is in areas of critical infrastructure or national security, there to be a minimum service level that must be maintained. Railways as well, I would include. So at least at that level, we know that the country can still properly function. What I really, really worry about with these is copycat strikes, which are already sort of happening across the public sector. And it just makes the country really, really hard for us to get our economy moving. We're already in recession. All of these strikes are having a significant impact.
All right, so you'd back that. Would you back new laws, minimum service level?
No, and the thing is, it's counterproductive. That point around respect is really important. There were some nurses who were suggesting actually the minimum service level in the wards that they work in is actually higher than what is currently there sometimes because of people being off, because of the lack of staffing. You know, and we're wasting huge amounts of money on locums who come in when in fact there are deeper issues here. What they are looking for is not just the pay rise, it's the respect that goes with it. It's the long-term plan that goes with it. That's what's missing. And if they've got time to spend, if Rishi Sunak wants to spend time on this, the answer is not legislation that's going to clog up Parliament and stopping things like the Victims Bill and other things from coming forward. The answer is for them to get that long-term plan sorted. There are people with great ideas, many of them nurses themselves. My urge to the government is please stop playing politics with this. And they are. We know they are. They want to fight with the unions. They think it's how they're going to get one over Labour. Come on, please just stop it, everybody.
But
people are literally dying because of
they
these
definitely
decisions.
don't want a fight with the nurses. I mean, in any competition between politicians and nurses, generally the nurses are going to win. So I wouldn't have said that this is something they actively want.
Well, it's interesting then on strategy in terms of a failure to find a resolution. I mentioned the UK interest rate rise, and someone else on the panel mentioned that inflation has come down a little bit from 11.1% to 10.7%. Is it a strategy, do you think, of the government to hold out and wait and hope that inflation comes down a little bit more, that we've reached the peak, and then they won't have to make a higher offer?
I'm not sure it's a strategy so much as a desperate hope.
What do you think it is, Bim?
There's so many conflicting things here, right?
Well, come on, what's your gut reaction? Is that why Steve Barclay is trying to hold out, saying it's unaffordable? I mean, he may be right, maybe it is unaffordable, or is it a case of they're hoping that inflation will come down? Well, anybody who's looked at the data knows that inflation's still going to be relatively high next year. It's not going to be down at 2 or 1%. We're probably at 6, 7, 8, 9%. So I don't think that is any way some form of sort of Machiavellian strategy. I think all this is to recognise that if across the whole public sector you get people getting pay rises of 15, 20%, and that sounds a lot, but that is what the nurses have asked for,
then that then goes across the private sector, and we've seen in history what happens to inflation in a country when that gets embedded in wages. And that is something we have to avoid.
It is disputed, this idea that the sort of demands, maybe not 19%, would lead to spiralling inflation, which is, I think, the term that BIM actually used. I mean, interest rates have gone up to try and combat inflation. It's also going to add to pressures of cost of living, isn't it?
It is, it is. I mean, I understand that. We know that some of those pressures are external, and we all hope and pray that, you know, the war in Ukraine will stop and that will help. But actually, this is not just what's happening now. I think the point that the nurses are making, and other public sector workers in particular are making, is that actually this is now years and years of pay restraint. And a service, particularly when we're looking at the NHS, that has been run into the ground. I know that the government likes to blame the pandemic for this, but if you look at the backlogs before the pandemic...
Well, it must have contributed.
Of course it did, but you know, it contributed to all parts of the economy. But the point is that there were backlogs before that point. This is not just caused by the pandemic. This is not just caused by the war in Ukraine. Right. This is caused by decisions that were not taken by the Tory government before.
We covered this story yesterday, which was the rescue operation in the English Channel after a migrant boat got into difficulties. A number of people died in that incident. Let's go to Dover, talk to our BBC correspondent there, Simon Jones. Hello to you, Simon. Can you bring us up to date with what's going on?
Well, I'm in Dungeness, and the Dungeness lifeboat, which you can see behind me, was heavily involved in the rescue operation yesterday. Today, the focus has changed. Instead, drones are being flown across the channel as part of that search operation. But the reality is, sadly now, they are looking for bodies. Now, the Coast Guard isn't clear how many people exactly may still be missing, because the boat, when it sank yesterday, was heavily overloaded, 40 to 50 people on board. We know that 4 people have been confirmed dead, but it's possible up to 4 more people are missing, and that's why the searches are ongoing. But at this time of year, the sea is only around 10 degrees, so people would only be able to survive for 5 to 10 minutes, perhaps even less time if people are panicking. So sadly now it is a recovery operation.
What's the Home Secretary been saying? She's obviously been in conversation with her counterpart in France.
Yes, Suella Braverman has been speaking to the French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin, and they issued a rare joint statement. Now, in that, they have vowed to work more closely than ever to try to stop the crossings. A big focus seems to be their effort to destroy the criminal gangs who are organising these crossings. But you're probably aware we have heard these sort of pledges many, many times over the years. And the reality is that the crossings continue despite all the government initiatives, despite all the promises of working together with the French and with the EU. Yesterday, as well as the boat that got into trouble, there were several boats that did make it across the channel. It shows that people are still coming despite the freezing temperatures.
Simon Jones in Dungeness, thank you very much. Bim, you heard there that the Home Secretary and her French counterpart want to destroy the business model of people smuggling gangs. How are they going to do it?
Well, it's not easy, and across the whole of Europe, this is a problem. This is not just a British problem or a French problem. Italians, Greece...
But the government's pledged to do something about this.
So I think, OK, there are a couple of things. First thing is we've got a proper, good working relationship with the French government. That is absolutely critical. There's no path to solving this without that, and that is definitely happening at all levels. Secondly, it's the agreement with Albania to make sure that we can return people much faster to Albania when they come over here. Other countries in Europe, like Germany and France, were having almost 100% rates of rejection for Albanian asylum seekers. Ours were below 50%. We can get that sorted out. And there are other things, obviously, domestic law, looking at the way how we treat people when they come here. All of those things combined, I think, can make a significant impact on this problem. But I would be wrong to suggest that I think this problem will go away, because this is a massive European problem to do with global migration from Africa moving into the Mediterranean and Europe.
All right, I'm going to come to you later in just a moment, because you have set out, as obviously expected, the government plan broadly. But some of your colleagues, Conservative MPs, want to go further. Jonathan Gullis, Tory MP in the House yesterday, had a 10-minute rule bill on leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, because he says he sees it as a barrier to doing some of the things that the government wants to do. Now, it didn't get through, but let's listen to what he said.
My bill will mean we can get the migrants who have entered the UK illegally onto the flights to Rwanda and in the future to other safe third countries to have their claims processed there by changing the law to explicitly ignore the European Court of Human Rights from meddling in our sovereignty on this specific matter.
It didn't get through, but quite a few people supported it. Conservative, a mistake?
It's a mistake because it tries to appear like a simple solution to what's a very complicated problem. It's very easy in politics to do that. It's a lot harder to solve it. I noticed that Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, who are obviously Prime Minister and Home Secretary earlier on this year, they supported it. My question was simply, if it was so easy to deal with, why didn't they do precisely that then, if it was going to deal with all the problem? It's because they know that it's much more complicated. But, you know, we've got to look at all angles, so we shouldn't rule anything out.
Are you proud of your government's record on this?
Well, it's a very difficult situation, and that's why we've got to try and deal with it.
So are you proud of it?
It's not about whether you're proud of it or not.
I mean,
we have tried to deal with a very difficult
that
problem.
After so many years of successive Home Secretaries and other senior Tory figures promising that they're going to do this and do that, the numbers keep rising. And look at the consequence, people drowning in the Channel. There's nothing compassionate about continuing to facilitate people coming over in this way. I'm only surprised and thankful that there haven't been more fatalities of the type that we saw yesterday, and we know that
when you say facilitate, what do you mean? I mean, would you support leaving the sort of international treaties and agreements if they were seen to be a barrier?
I would support doing whatever it takes to end this absolute scourge.
How would
Quite
it help?
simply, we should not be letting those boats cross at all. So we've got drones out today on a search and rescue or recovery mission. Those drones should be part of an overall operation for which we absolutely have the technology to detect when vessels are about to attempt the crossing and stop them making that crossing. And if we fail to do that, as they make progress, rather than bringing them and escorting them over to our own coastline, we should turn them back. It was done perfectly successfully in Australia. It isn't particularly politically easy, but it's short-term pain for long-term gain.
Well,
once you show that you mean it, they stop coming.
Kat, I mean, that was rejected. I think it was in Priti Patel's time, actually, when she tried to introduce turn back, or whatever the technical term was. What's your reaction to what Isabel said?
Well, I think the United Nations has already said it would breach international law, and it's not a sort of humane approach. And
it's not humane to let this carry on, though, is it?
No, I agree. But clearly something needs to happen, and I think actually what needs to happen is more working with the French authorities, more working with the Algerians, more trying to actually solve the cause of the problem rather than the symptom, which is the people crossing.
But it is no coincidence that the small boats crossings really ramped up and the deaths associated, and I couldn't agree more. There is nothing to be proud of about what's going on right now. It's frankly shameful. But it started really ramping up when we closed all the safe and legal routes to come here.
Yeah.
And so there is an alternative, and it is a different approach, and appreciate that there needs to be a political debate about that. But the other solution is that you open safe and legal routes. That's how you take the power away from the traffickers, is you have a route that is sanctioned by government, that allows, for example, the Dub scheme with the resettlement of children, refugees. We stop that completely. We have totally underplayed our hand in our ability to help that.
All right, now what sort of routes are you talking about in terms of expanding
I'll give
them?
you
because the numbers, you will know, the net migration figures were about 504,000 this year. They were a record high. A vast number, in fact, 276,000 were humanitarian and other family visas, accounted for particularly now Ukrainians, the agreement with Hong Kong, and Afghans, the smallest number, I have to say, 21,000, and that was 15,000 through Operation Pitting. 3 parts of the world. Would you like to expand them across the world? Would you like to see hundreds and thousands of people coming through those routes?
Actually, it's interesting. You mentioned the Afghan route. I have a case right now of a family who worked with the British Army, whose the Taliban have taken up residence in their house to keep an eye on them. And I cannot get a minister to meet with me to talk about the case to bring them over, despite the fact that they helped us out there. We have completely failed.
And we'll come on to Afghanistan, particularly because the numbers are very low. But you know, if we're talking about other countries, would you want a safe and legal route from Iran, for example? Would you want one from Eritrea?
I've called for a lifeboat scheme for the brave women of Iran. But I think we've got to be mindful here that if what we're talking about is small boats crossings,
Yeah.
these people who are coming over, they are from Afghanistan, they are from Syria, they are from Sudan, they are from Eritrea.
By no means the majority.
No, but actually a lot of them are,
And they've
more than
passed
half.
through- they've passed through many safe countries.
But the
So
question is
let
when you're
me-
coming from an entirely safe place in Europe.
Exactly.
No, well,
that is the key problem.
Fine, but let's talk about Iran. I mean, should there be a safe and legal route from Iran?
I just don't think we can just
We'd
whenever
be
there's
Hang on,
whenever there's a country that's going through political turmoil, sad as that is, we just cannot be a country that says everybody come to Britain. That is just never a feasible scenario. So no, I don't support us widening this to all countries
Even
which
if
is
they
facing
have
internal.
family here, and actually,
Well,
the
there
vast
are routes. Now, there
majority-
are-
and I will
hang on,
say-
hang on, there
and I will
are
say
routes.
A large
There
number
are
of these
routes.
people want to go back. I've got. So we had some who managed to get over, for example, from Syria. They have settled, but they desperately want to go back to those countries. And I will just make a wider point. The Liberal Democrats talk about 0.7% of aid, of GNI going to aid. The bigger issue here are issues of climate change, of war. If we invest in other parts of the world, actually that is in our own self-interest because it helps people to stay there and stay in those regions rather than come here. And I don't think that's the only reason to be giving aid, but I do think it's a compelling reason why we should look again at how we've reduced the amount of aid and the impact that that's having on this issue.
I mean, is that, you said you want to look at everything. Is that worth looking at? More safe and legal routes? I mean, I'll just pick one of them, the Mandate Resettlement Scheme. It opened in 1995 to resettle refugees who have a close family member in the UK who can offer a home to them. 2 people were resettled in 2021. It's just one of the schemes. The Refugee Family Reunion opened in 2011. 6,134 visas were granted through this route, and about 144 under a community sponsorship scheme, again for 2021. And the UK resettlement scheme resettled 1,125 refugees. Is that enough, or should they be expanded, or should there be more leaflet?
Look, first of all, I think we should probably simplify the number of schemes. Secondly, I repeat, we cannot now just expand the number of routes that people from more countries can come here, because I just don't think that's sustainable at all. But we need to also bear in mind that where we have people coming from safe countries, that needs to be stamped out as a practice, because that clearly is not entirely about just fleeing from war or persecution, because they are already somewhere where they are safe. And what is happening is that a lot of people who, by the way, people like my parents and grandparents who came to this country from Nigeria, who want to come to this country for economic reasons, and that's a perfectly legitimate aim to have. Some of those people are using the asylum route from some certain other countries. That's why they're coming through safe countries. And I'm afraid that we have to say no. You have to come the right way.
There is a point of agreement I think we can probably find, though, is that unless you tackle the backlog, and unless you are actively trying to work to sort out the wheat from the chaff, to sort out the traffickers from the people with genuine asylum claims, I will say that when they do that, they find that the vast majority of people who are coming over do have legitimate claims. But I think it helps no one, especially the most vulnerable, that we have such a huge backlog that the government can say, well, they're all economic migrants, despite the fact that their own data suggests otherwise. But the backlog, unless you sort it out, we don't know.
All right, well, Rishi Sunak has said he's going to see more staff employed to deal with that backlog. And that's obviously something that Layla supports. And there doesn't seem to be support. That's why Jonathan Gullis's bill did not go through Parliament to withdraw from international obligations. Do you think it will ever gain enough support as a route to tackle this issue?
I think it speaks to yet another one of the many divisions in the Conservative Party right now, that there is a real difference of opinion on this. I mean, we saw fairly recently Tim Loughton taking Suella Braverman to pieces over the safe and legal routes that he was pointing out don't exist. And that is not necessarily, he's not necessarily from a wing of the party that you would think necessarily would have those kind of issues. But this is a very difficult problem that Conservative MPs are deeply troubled over because of the political framing of it.
It's not going to happen, is it, leaving the European Convention on Human Rights or rewriting the Refugee Convention?
What I would say is that there's a touching naivety to what you suggest, that if we just sort of create loads of safe and legitimate routes for people to come, we'll somehow be able to cope with the unbelievable numbers you will get. Do you know how many people there are on the move across the world? Tens of millions of people are on the move at the moment, and the UK is a very attractive prospect to a lot of those people, not least because of the language. So it is totally unrealistic to suggest that setting up safe and easy routes would lead to anything other than a massive additional backlog, the very backlog that you're saying we need to get through with what we've got.
Let's move on to the Pandemic Diaries by Matt Hancock. You helped write his personal account, Isabel, of COVID, when you've said you fundamentally disagree with his handling of the pandemic.
Absolutely.
So why on earth did you write it with him?
Well,
help him write
who
it?
better to write it than someone that was actually going to put him under a great deal of pressure to reveal exactly what happened? Look, I was quite a prominent and vocal critic of the response to the pandemic. I fundamentally disagree with the lockdown strategy.
But you've given it publicity,
taken.
his version of all those decisions that you disagreed with.
Have you read it?
No, I haven't
well,
had a
there
chance
you go.
to.
I think if you read it, I think you'd find that it's not actually as flattering of Matt Hancock's response as you might expect.
Except some who have said this in The Guardian. Matt Hancock accused of rewriting history in Pandemic book. Tory ex-minister Stephen Dorrell questions whether Hancock would stand by some of his claims under oath.
Well, I think he probably would. And I mean, of course, The Guardian would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, Matt Hancock opened up an awful lot of communications legitimately for me to see. And what I can say is that everything that is quoted in the book is actually there, it's verifiable. He went back into the department, went over his notes. Look, my agenda was not to make Matt Hancock look good. My agenda was to get as close as possible as I could to the truth from the person who was at the heart of it all.
And did you get close to the truth if there are claims of that?
I'm not naive enough to imagine that I got the full truth, only the truth and nothing but the truth, and that nothing was left out. But I think I got a heavier dollop of the truth than probably anyone else would have got, particularly if they were sympathetic as a starting point.
People have already accused Matt Hancock for rewriting history around the issue of care homes. But he says specifically that the vast majority of infections were brought in from the wider community, mainly by staff, as opposed to the claims that the National Care Association made, which was actually, it was much more about hospital elderly patients untested for COVID being returned to care homes.
Yeah, and I noticed that since the book has come out, care home managers have suggested that they've got a different version of the story. And I think, actually, Isabel, for what it's worth, you've been very upfront about that. It is this one side of the story. And I take heart, actually, that you, as someone who was sceptical of his approach, wrote it. I think that's a good thing. But from my perspective, we have to appreciate that there is no one version of history. And the most definitive version that I'm looking forward to reading to is probably the report that the COVID inquiry is going to create, because at that point, we are also going to hear from the voices that aren't Matt Hancock, the small voices, the care home managers, the people who have had people who've died, the people currently living with long COVID, who are all affected by the decisions he made. So this is one version, and perfectly fine that it's done.
And you make
I can
a really
understand
important point about the inquiry, and I really hope that it is not a whitewash. And we need to hear from the full array, including those who were fundamentally critical of the response all the way through. And at the moment, the evidence does not suggest, encouragingly, that dissenting voices will actually be included as part of that inquiry. They should be.
I think it's important that, Matt Hancock also isn't left off the hook with this. And I'm worried that there's a reason he's written it now. It's not just for Christmas. It's also because he wants his version out there first. It's clear from, everything that we've seen that he does have a lot to answer for, and he's hoping to shift that narrative. It's also why he did the I'm a Celebrity thing. He wants to connect with the public because he realises he totally lost that trust. What worries me is that he's going to step down as an MP. I'm fine. But we know another pandemic will come in the same way that one came before. This is going to happen again. So what are the lessons that we are going to learn? I'm not interested in Matt Hancock's reputation. What I'm interested in is getting as close to the truth as possible, hearing the whole range without fear or favour, and then actually having a plan for the next time.
And should the plan include lockdowns?
Potentially.
Isabel is very sceptical that lockdowns were worth it, were a price worth paying. Where are you on that?
I am sorry that I didn't voice a lot of my internal scepticism.
I wish you had. I
more,
wish you had.
More
Why
at the
weren't
time
you braver? Not just you, but others.
At the time about the nature of these. At the very beginning, I think everybody just was so scared and freaked out that we just had to act very quickly. I think as time went on, as the months went by, it became apparent there was a lot of disquiet about the strategy. And I'd be very interested to listen to the COVID inquiry and read it and read Matt's book to actually figure out how were those sort of private warnings going to government, how were they being received internally by Matt and Boris as Prime Minister?
So you don't think they were worth it, lockdowns?
No, what I'm saying is there was a point in time at which we probably reached for that sort of big, heavy mallet when we probably should have done something more tailored.
All hindsight is a wonderful thing. I mean, Matt Hancock writes in the book that Chris Whitty, the UK's most senior doctor, warned him that as many as 820,000 people in the UK may die in a reasonable worst-case scenario without restrictions. What would you have done faced with Chris Whitty in the room at that time when we did not know what the COVID pandemic could do? Let it rip?
So, no, and that warning was very early on. I think it was probably in February.
Fine.
I don't know if you've got the extract
faced with
there.
that, Isabel, what would you do?
So I actually agree with you on this. I think it was entirely reasonable to have the initial lockdown while we worked out what it was that we were dealing with. My own view is that we should thereafter have gone down the route of the Barrington Declaration, which is proposed by an awful lot of very eminent epidemiologists and other public health specialists, where we sought to protect the most vulnerable whilst allowing everybody else to get on with things. We now know that COVID is completely manageable. Initially, it was a more
We didn't have a vaccine,
version.
of course, until a year after it
and
started.
I think that was important.
We actually don't know the long-term impacts of it still.
Yeah,
I mean, I can't believe you're saying it's completely manageable.
Well,
I
is manageable. Look, we're not locking down now, are we?
I think there were some things like schools being shut down, which now in hindsight we can say perhaps that was a step too far because it wasn't, it didn't affect children, thankfully. But obviously there was a concern around teaching staff as well. You know, I mean, and up until the point that we had a vaccine, no one was safe, and we still don't know. There are
It's not true that no one was safe. It's just not true. The statistical chance of children dying from COVID was tiny.
But
it was tiny.
But it was about spreading, wasn't it, Isabel? That's
what
people were worried about.
We now know that the vaccine didn't stop.
Well, we do now know.
Well, that's
hang
not
on.
totally true. I mean, I'm chair of the all-party group on coronavirus, and what we tried to do at the beginning was actually bring some of that light that people are now looking for in hindsight at the time, because our concern was that Matt Hancock and others were going to make all these decisions without proper scrutiny, and that politically everyone was going to go, oh my God, we just have to do what they say,
And I think
because
that's
there
what
isn't.
happened.
And I'm concerned that we're now, you know, he's got his version of the story.
Yeah, but you
fine.
wanted zero COVID,
didn't
you,
well,
Leila?
when
You
we
wanted
knew nothing,
full elimination.
No, at the beginning, I think we've all just agreed. When we knew nothing, we all said that we needed to lock down, see what we were dealing with. And there was a moment in time where you'll remember the WHO and others were suggesting that if we got on top of this quickly, that there might be a way to really suppress it. As time went on and the evidence changed, and particularly we got a vaccine, very proud of that. I'm an Oxford MP. A lot of these people are my constituents. That changed, and so did our recommendation. The point of the all-party parliamentary group still, and we exist still, is to look at the evidence and make recommendations based on the most recent evidence. I'm a science teacher. Science evolves. As the science changes, you change your mind and you change your policies. The issue was that we had science butting up against politics, and I think one of the interesting points in your article, you said that there was something about mission creep about the vaccines.
Yeah.
I will say, one of the frustrations that I still have is the inability for the international community to get together and apply that strategy across the world, because the most vulnerable in some countries were not being vaccinated, while we were vaccinating people who were actually much less likely to get COVID in the first place. And actually, that was a really important point that seems to have come to light.
You now say, with some hindsight, that perhaps there should have been a little more scrutiny, perhaps, about further lockdowns. Can you imagine another lockdown? We've just heard Leila saying there will be another pandemic. Could you ever rule out another nationwide lockdown?
I think if there is another pandemic when I'm in politics, there will be an extreme amount of questioning and scepticism over the nature and timing of it. going forward, though, the one thing I think the health bosses, people in NHS England and the equivalents in other parts of the world, they need to rethink their strategy around beds in hospitals, how they manage capacity, because what I think we've found, and we're seeing it with the backlogs, is that more capacity in our hospitals can help us deal with any future pandemic or big shock like that.
Invest in our NHS.
You've got the last word. There you go. With your little campaign slogan. Thank you very much to all of our guests. I will be back on Monday with more Politics Live, and Politics UK will be on at 12:15 tomorrow. Bye-bye.